what's up, comrades? Hope everyone's doing great. We're here to talk about a game I played, a kind of like Souls-like game that I tried playing a while ago when it popped up free on like PlayStation Plus or something, and I hit against it real hard. There's like a lot of random systems, and the game's really dark, and I was just kind of like not feeling it at all. But I powered my way through to like the first boss, and he kicked the shit out of me, and I was like, damn, I'm gonna have to grind a lot to get through this guy. So I wasn't a fan of that, so I stopped playing it. But it popped up on Thick Girls repack site, so I was like, yeah, fuck it, I can cheat engine this now. So just to like get through the grinding, just to level myself up enough so that I feel confident about getting through this game. So that's what I did. The game also has like a hard cap for levels, which is interesting. That being said, I normally do kind of like just like I go through the story of games, right? But this game is like, it is like super Dark Soulsy. So even Dark Souls games, like the originator of like the Soulsborne thing, they have stories. Like you start at the beginning and then you can work your way to the end, and there's like things that are going on that like sometimes are very confusing unless you like really dig deep into like the lore, but you can kind of like follow a thorough line of like a story of things that are occurring with a beginning and end. This game does not really have that. Like it kind of does, but it's so bare minimum that I decided I was going to try something different with this guy, and we were going to go through we're going to like delve deep into the lore. And to do that, the lore doesn't come from items, unlike a lot of the Dark Souls games, but it comes from like items. So you pick up like tracks, if you will, like pieces of paper around, notebook pieces, all this stuff. So what I'm going to do is kind of cover like the gist of the story. No. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to go through, there's only like 4 levels. So I'm going to go through like the 4 levels, talk about and then go through kind of like what you find and kind of explore that as we're going along. And then what I'm going to do is go through those we'll go through that, and then I'll kind of give like the summary of like the brief story that exists from all the information that I'm reading, and then talk about the endings, because there's like 6 endings. Okay, so let's do that. So the first location we're going to discuss is called Philosopher's Hill. There's not a lot here, but there's a few things that are very important. And one thing I should probably mention. Okay, so here like the cast of characters that and I'll introduce people as they come along, but the main people to know are Corvus, who is the guy we play, who has some sort of like powers, which we'll get into as we go along. There's Isami, who is a princess of the kingdom, and she's also somewhat of like an alchemist, and she's the one who kind of guides Corvus in like retrieving his memories so that he can initiate like the Hermes protocol. That's not what it's called, but it's something like that, to kind of like get an ending to the game. And so she will also periodically examine cores and stuff that we get. Cores we get from like bosses, right? They're like boss souls, and they're integral to like the overall like ending of the game that you get and whatnot. And then there's Emerald. Emerald is Isami's teacher, and she's an alchemist from like another country that came, and she like randomly appears in levels. Isami is always in the Philosopher's Hill, and I guess to kind of go about it as well, I think let's just talk about the tutorial. So you start the game off, and you're in the what do you call it? You're in Hermes Fortress, and you're kind of going around. It's a tutorial level, right? So you just learn how to fight, learn how to your abilities. There's like feathers that you can use to parry. There is a dodge. There's like you can attack at the same time, kind of like in Sekiro, to do some abilities. And then you get like your souls, and then the souls you use to level up. You can only level up to like level 50. And so you have to, and there's pretty much 3 areas you level up. You level up like your attack, like your phantom attacks or your plague attacks, which is like your special weapons, and then like your claw. And then there is kind of like dodging ability, if you will. And that levels up different stats, which give you like more strength, more defense, more life, stuff like that, and more mana, because all your phantom attacks, or sorry, your plague attacks, which are like your special weapon attacks that you can change, and you can have up to 2 of them if you equip your skills correctly. So then there's also like a skill leveling system where you can invest in certain skills, and the game's pretty nice about letting you reset and kind of try different builds, so that's cool. And then again, those focus on like your main attack, which is like your sword. Then there's like your plague attacks, which are like your special weapons. There's the feathers, which are like the counter attacks. And then there's just kind of just general like more life, more this, more that. All right, so the tutorial kind of explains all this as you go through and you kill some guys, you fight some bosses, you find like different ways to attack. There's like different responses to different things. It's all pretty good, right? Like the combat can be very interesting, and how you like respond to certain things and very like time based. Trying to like do certain defenses against certain attacks. So again, kind of like leaning into that kind of Sekiro where there's like different maneuvers that you can utilize, or you can just kind of try to like dodge and power through. There's no stamina in this game. So you can dodge, and but the enemies are faster too. And then you can attack. Your original attack gets 3-hit combo before a pause, but then you can upgrade it to like a 5-hit combo, and then before there's a pause. So that's pretty cool. Okay, the thing's like got a very gothic, Bloodborne sort of vibe to it. So we fight our way through the tutorial, and eventually you run into Vogue and Erd, and you get destroyed immediately. And then you end up at Philosopher's Hill. So Philosopher's Hill, where Isami's like, oh, you ready for something? I see that you survived like this attack and were able to crawl yourself back here. You should be more careful because you're integral to like the saving or destroying of like the Hermes Kingdom or whatever. And then she encourages you to relive your memories so that you can make a decision, because you're tied into this whole thing, and that's like the mystery, and we get more into that as we like find things and as the game goes on. So we'll pause there. So at Philosopher's Hill, there's a few different tracks that we find. We find the Hermes Royal Bulletin. It talks about how the families of the knights petition the king to stop sending the knights to other kingdoms to like fight and whatever. And then it also talks about how Emerald officially was getting ready to appoint someone to replace her in like the Alchemy Academy or whatever, which is obviously going to be Isami, her like main student. And then we learn about the Twilight Circus, which exists in the Sea of Trees, and how they've been invited by the royal court, and how Odur, who's the ringmaster, has a new performance that was very well received. We also find a journal by Isami. She talks about how the Philosopher's Hill is a sanctuary to the royal family, and that every fall they come here, the whole family comes here, and that her dad lets her call her father instead of like his majesty or whatever. But as like the outbreak of the plague, that's something we learned that there's been this like plague that has like outbreaked over the whole world, and that Hermes Kingdom was able to hold it off the longest essentially, but then they started to fall too. So as the outbreak got worse and worse, and as things kind of got more crazy, the king was more busy, so they made it less and less often over here. The last note we find in Philosopher's Hill is Edward the Blessed's note. And Edward the Blessed is the name of the king. So he's the king, and he talks about how he loves coming out to spend time with his children here and whatnot, and he talks about the strange sickness in the lands beyond his borders, and that he has to, he's very concerned about preparing everybody, preparing the kingdom for this plague. And that's all we really get from Philosopher's Hill. We get some other tracks later on as the game progresses, but I just keep them in line with like kind of when you get them in these certain areas. So, yeah, we'll deal with those as we come along then. So the first memory we recollect is the Sea of Trees. And the Sea of Trees, as we learned before, is where the Twilight Circus exists, and that they're very important to this overall thing. So the Sea of Trees is this kind of level where we go from like tree to tree to tree, and we're on these like rope bridges and stuff, and then the circus plays like a predominant role in this whole area. We also end up fighting Ordu as like the boss, and then there's some other stuff going on with that as well. So there's, like I said, there's 4 levels. Philosopher's Hill isn't really a level, but there's Hermes Fortress, there's the Royal Gardens, and there's the Sea of Trees. And then once you beat like the main campaign level, there's usually some sub quests for each one where you can like get more information, get more cores, learn more about what's going on in the lore and the history of the world, just to make sure like that you're able to kind of track and follow what's going on. So let's go through the lore. So I talk about these in the order that I kind of picked them up essentially, but I combine them. So the first time I run into, for example, like the note from the unknown hopeless, I'm going to cover not just like the first one, but like all of them that are there. All right. So the first set of manuscripts we find is the village elder's manuscripts. He talks about how knights have come down, and that they inquired with him about these buckets, the buckets the circus is keeping and whatnot. And the elder knows that they're keeping animals in the buckets, but he doesn't want to betray Ordu because Ordu takes care of the village, and the people of the village are so grateful for Ordu and all that he does, because the people of the Sea of Trees get treated like shit. But like those who don't live in the Sea of Trees, they're kind of seen as like the lessers, the hopeless is what they're called. And that, because Ordu always helps, he wants to feel like he's helping as well. Then we find a note from the unknown hopeless. This guy talks about how he wants to work for the circus. It pays really well. It'll help his family. And then when he showed up, they did a health exam, and they mentioned something very interesting about his body being just what they were looking for. He then goes on and talks about how, of the buckets again, and how they have animals in them, or some sort of moving creature. And that a research group has come down to the Sea of Trees, and they're asking about the circus and what the circus is doing and all this stuff. And they mention to him that the circus works for the Central Authority, but that he should keep this difference. He then later mentions that there was some sort of incident that occurred, and after this incident occurred, that these cysts began to growing on all these like sacred trees that the buildings are built around, and that the circus stopped performing at this time. But that even though they're not performing, they're still recruiting in like large numbers of people to come. Then as time goes by, the people became sicker and sicker. But some people became stronger. So some people became very sick. Some people kind of mutated and became stronger. And these people started growing branches out of their bodies. And that the prophets of the Sea of Trees talked about how they were blessed by the sacred trees and everything was going to be great for them. His final note discusses an order called the Workers' Inn and told them that the cysts were causing the fog. And that they had to gather the cysts or gather the fog or something, gather it and bring it to the idol, that the idol would purify them and the Sea of Trees, and that once they purified the idol and brought it to like life, essentially, that it would return to its former state. The next manuscript we find is the Tree Blessed manuscript. It talks about how these group of people that got exiled from like the Hermes kingdom, essentially, that they came down to the sacred trees area, and that they built their homes surrounding like the trees, because the trees protect them from the monsters and from the plague, and that even carrying like a broken twig from one of these sacred trees will drive off the pestilence. Next we get a couple tracks about the life of Hermes. So we find these throughout the whole game. There was like the notes on Hermes' life, this or that. So the Sea of Trees, notes on Hermes' life, talks about how every residence is constructed around the trees because they protect and bless the people. And that if a resident has to be placed away from the sacred tree for whatever reason, they always take pieces of bark or branches that have fallen off that helps drive off the plague. And then that there's a giant storehouse that's filled with tons of stuff from the mainland, that the circus has gathered, and that it's heavily guarded by the circus and by the knights. We find another set of tracks on the notes on Hermes' life about the circus, and that the circus was originally started as a means of escapism for the village workers, and gradually it grew and grew and grew. And so originally it was just like the group of villagers like got together, put together shows to like help them escape from how horrible their lives were, essentially. And then it grew and grew and became like an actual circus, and they called themselves Twilight Circus, due to their usually doing nighttime performances, as well as like finding some joy in the hardships of life. A while ago, Ordu came and joined the circus, became the ringmaster, brought it to its like peak. It would like travel around, add all this money and all this like prestige to like the Sea of Trees people, and kind of give people an opportunity to kind of work their way out of like this destitution that they're in. But some people had different opinions about the matter. And it talks about how Ordu is a wild, ambitious, and prideful man. Like, he seems to have come from noble stock, and that he's skilled in illusion and hat tricks, and that he was able to use his skills and the circus to enter the circles of nobility. We find a note from a royal guard. This mentions that some of the knights headed into the Sea of Trees under the guise of wanting to help the research team kind of figure out what's going on, but actually they were there specifically to investigate what was going on with the Twilight Circus. We then get this legend of the Four Thieves Vinegar, and I'm not going to talk about these a lot. Some of these I just skipped talking about. There's so part of your Eustace flasks in this game, they're just potions or whatever. You can combine different herbs into them to give them like other abilities. And throughout the game, you're going to find these like tracks that they have little stories, or they'll just talk about combinations of like the herbs, like basil, rosemary, thyme, that you can put into these potions that will cause like even greater effects. And so you get these recipes very like, man, I love how they do this. It's like built into the lore, because you find these tracks and they'll tell like little stories, and in the stories it'll give you like the recipe, as well as like the story kind of explains what the potion is supposed to do. So I'll talk about this one, because I thought it was the funnest. So when he talks about there's all these thieves in the Sea of Trees, and that some of these hoodlums seem to have received the blessing of pure blood, or seem to have, even though they've never received the blessing of pure blood, which we'll find out later kind of protects you versus the plague, yet they're completely immune to the plague. And then after one of these thieves was caught and tortured, he essentially was revealed that you had to combine like rosemary, sage, and some medicine, and that it had a sterilizing effect when rubbed on the body, and that this recipe was passed down through his family line for years. And so if you go into like the potion and put rosemary, sage, and I think basil, because that's why I remember that one, into like your potion to give it like its bonus, then you'll get immunity to like the cysts, which create like this fog which poisons you and gives you the plague and will kill you, kind of like a poison thing. All right. Next up is the manuscript of a hopeless prophet. He complains about how the people are desecrating the sacred trees, cutting bark and stuff at them, and that he has spoken to his God, and that God will not go easy on them. Next up is a whistleblower's records. This is an interview of a laborer who's whistleblowing to like the knights. He had friends who worked for the circus, and that he tells them they kept injecting them with strange medicine, which they in turn injected into the animals, and that they would then put the animals in these buckets and move them around and do all sorts of stuff, but that the compensation was excellent. But that, the friend who was telling him all this stuff, because it wasn't him actually doing this, one day he just like disappeared completely. We have the experiences of a hopeless builder. This talks about Emerald, the alchemist, who brought alchemy to the Hermes kingdom. Also a bunch of other things, like an elevator system to the Sea of Trees. And this makes it easy for everybody to get up to the main tent where Order is, and that's something we have to use when we get to him as a boss. It mentions an accident happening and then the fog occurring. And it talks about how Order mentioned it was the plague. So help the residents build an idol that would protect everyone from the plague. And that he's very happy that Order is looking out for everybody. He then mentions that he was chosen to work on the idol and that it's like built from like a giant tree and that it seems like it's breathing. We get the Sea of Trees record of a mysterious event. An individual is collecting samples with other researchers, and then they felt like one of the researchers, right, felt a massive wave of energy throughout the whole forest, and then things started to change. This thick fog suddenly appeared, and then these strange balloon-like cysts grew on the tree. So something occurred. Again, we keep hinting at this like incident that occurred, and then afterwards, everyone started feeling sick. We finally get some notes from Ordo himself. Ordo's construction notes mention that he created another self. He wondered if there was a way to have a stronger existence. And then he talks about how she helped him begin a massive project, and that he was inspired from an old legend of a creature who could be built to protect the lowly ones and the sacred trees, with the sacred trees infused with vile blood. And then we get Odor's vile blood research notebook, where he talks about how people have the plague ridden misunderstood. They're not monsters. He believes they're the next stage of evolution, and that he needs more vile blood to reach his goal. That he needs all of it. So then in the Sea of Trees, there's 3 cores that we can get, and when we take these cores, and there's like 3 cores in a notebook, two notes. And that when we take these things, when we pick them up, we don't actually get anything from them. We have them, but then we have to take them to Isome and Emerald, and both of them give us like different opinions on the matter. So the first one is Order's core, which we get for beating the boss, right? So Order ends up being the first boss. He sucks ass. He has like 2 parts. He was hard as shit, even like when I like overleveled. So we take it to Isome. She mentions that it's strange because he was given pure blood to protect him from the plague. So now I'm going to talk about the cores you get from the Sea of Trees. The first one is the Order's core. So every time you beat like a boss, and again, so you have the main story stuff that's going on with the main boss, and then once you do that, you unlock like the next world out of the 4. And then you can go back to the previous world and do like the side quests, which are just like you go through the level of different, like you go through it backwards, you go through just a portion of it, or sometimes there's just like a whole new level that has the same like aesthetics and whatnot. So we go back, so the Order, and then when you get the cores and some of the items you get from these like subquests at the end, like these notes and whatnot, you take them to Isome and she'll have a commentary, and then Emerald will also have commentary. So for Ordo's core, Isome mentions that it's strange, that it's vile, because Ordo was full of like pure blood, that the king was giving him pure blood. So why is his core filled with vile blood? And when we take it to Emerald, she is like fucking impressed. She's like, wow, this is such good research. And that talks about how like Ordo was wasting his time in the circus, and that he should have been working with the researchers and helping her specifically with like her blood research or her like plague research or whatever. Then as we go through the levels, we end up fighting like this giant puppet that people kept mentioning, like the idol. The idol ends up being this like giant wood tree golem full of like the pulses, like the pusses, the cysts. That's what they call them in this. The cysts. And so we fight this like giant thing by like running up this like scaffolding essentially, and then destroying all its like cysts as we run up, and then eventually doing like a Sekiro jumping off a cliff to kill the snake attack on this thing. And then when we get its core, we take it back to Isome, and then she mentions that Ordo clearly knew about their research, and that he took a lot of the research information, like the alchemy research, and that he transformed it, and by his like self-study alone, by just studying their stuff and kind of figuring stuff out, he was able to create this like enormous puppet. And that this might be the reason why Ordo's core was full of vile blood because of this creation or whatever. And then when we take it to Emerald, she is like even more fucking impressed. She's like, oh, it's a masterpiece. And then she's like, did you really have to destroy it? Was that really important? I would have loved to like examine it and stuff. It's so fucking impressive. And she's like, I wish I understood how he got it to even move. And then if we get all the way through the subquest, we unlock like the true boss of the Sea of Trees, which is a mutated Ordu. And so once we kill him and get his core, and taking it to Isami, she talks about how like there's a mixture of pure and vile blood that will produce uncontrollable mutations. And that it also contains like incomparable power, right? So apparently there's like this pure blood that people can get, and then there's vile blood, which we learn about both of these in the next couple of levels. But then when you combine them together, it's even like crazier. And then we take it to Emerald, and she's like super impressed again, just the repeat. And that she talks about how Ordu has had an incredible understanding of alchemy, and that then she kind of mentions offhanded that there's a fine line between being a genius and being insane. But she believes that Ordu saw the truth, and that he understands things like alchemical concepts that others can't understand. Also in the Sea Trees, we find 2 reports. We find a transformation report 1 and 2, which again, we take both of them to Isami. So Isami, from the report, she talks about how that using alchemy, you can infuse new life into things. And that she doesn't know where Corvus came from, but that her teacher, Emerald, had something to do with our like creation or imbuing us with life or doing something. And that she refuses to tell Isami. And then she also mentions that Emerald warned her about getting too close to your experiments as an alchemist. And the last thing she gets from the transformation report number 2 is that there was a lot of experiments that were done on the giant trees, and they found that the giant trees could easily absorb plague, but when you inserted the giant tree, like the bark and stuff, into humans to try to like fuse them together to like create like a plague barrier, that it didn't work. Emerald, on the other hand, she is super fascinated by the transformation, like our transformation or whatever. And she talks again about the giving infected people new life through alchemy. And then she kind of hints at interspecies fusion being required for like the use of certain alchemical properties, but that it's not an easy thing to do to infuse like a human life with like an animal life and like whatever else. And then she like looks at us, she's like, you're one of the lucky ones. So clearly from this we learn that Corvus is not like all human anymore at this point. And then in the transformation report 2, when we take it to her, she talks about how again like the sacred tree has absorbed the plague, and that they could insert, even though it didn't work on humans like Isami was talking about, that you could take pieces of the sacred tree and insert them in animals, and that when you inserted them into animals, then they were protected from the plague. So something about like combining the sacred trees with animals protected them, but it didn't work with humans. And so dun dun dun, that's why the animal like human fusion was in the next level of experimentation, because it's like, well, if we can't fuse the trees directly into humans, but we can fuse them into animals, what if we fuse these animals that have like the bark in them into humans? Like, what would that do? And again, it's like, so we were the lucky ones. So part of the reason why we can play as Corvus and we can like be successful and be alive and not die from the plague like permanently or be attacked by the plague or mutated is because of this fusion with the bark and the animals and then us. Good stuff. The next level we get to is the Royal Gardens. And the Royal Gardens is interesting. It's kind of split up between like literal like gardens and then an underground level, and then there's like a library. But we start off with like in the library gardens area. And in fact, one of the first notes we find is notes on Hermie life about the garden. And it talks about there's a treasure trove of knowledge with between the greenhouse and all the alchemical stuff and all the plants and exotic stuff, and then the library, which is super precious because it contains all the writings of all the researchers and the alchemists and everything. And then it's so precious that the king has some of his top like guards and elite warriors like patrolling it all days and night to make sure it's protected, that no one can do anything about it. And then besides the researchers in the libraries and stuff and the guards, are the gardeners, and the gardeners spend more time obviously in the gardens aspect, working with like rare species and helping to like get alchemical like components that are needed and for the research to be established there. Next up, we find an introduction to alchemy. It talks about alchemy as an area of science that researches the nature of objects, and that all things can be divided into smaller and smaller units, and that eventually we get to these basic units, and these basic units can be drastically different than the units that they eventually combine to make, right? Next is an experienced researcher's notebook, and there's a series of these, but it talks about how Emerald is incredible, that by following her instructions, so clearly Emerald is not from like the Hermes Kingdom, is what kind of we're starting to figure out here. So Emerald is incredible. By following her instructions, they're able to create all sorts of equipment, right? We learned about the elevator in the previous, but also there's like other random stuff that they are creating here in the Kingdom of Hermes that makes it strong. And it's not just alchemy that she has a lot of information about, but this is all these components and the alchemy and everything is what makes Hermes such a strong kingdom. And then after she's taught them all about alchemy and stuff, she's like, all right, you guys have enough information. You just kind of do what you got to do. I'm going to go do this other thing. So then she started burying herself in her own research, working alone, and that she records everything in like a notebook that she carries around. And then at some point, the researcher mentions that she started meeting with mysterious visitors for private discussions in her lab. And whenever she was asked about it, she talked about how it would shatter alchemy and it would somehow achieve like a perfect harmony. But this seemed to them to be like a cause to destroy like all her work up to this point, because it was like drastically different. And like, again, it's like you're changing alchemy, then it's like all this stuff's got to go. Another researcher's notebook that we find, it's got a lot of almost every passage starts with like unintelligible writing, and then we get into it. And it talks about how the blood of the infected, that they're somehow gaining access to the blood of the infected from the plague, and they're using it as like a raw material, and that they can do certain things to it, and then what it does is it kind of cleanses the blood so that it becomes pure blood. And okay, so that's where they're getting the pure blood from the plague victims, and then they're turning it into pure blood. But that it's not just like all good at that point, that when they create the pure blood, that vile blood is also created, right? So so there's like the plague blood, and then from that they're able to like separate the pure blood, but it creates like the vile blood, which is highly contagious. And any biological organism that like comes into contact it will immediately like attach to it, infect it, and mutate it. So the mutants are coming from the vile blood, not from the plague itself. And that's why the Kingdom of Hermes has like these monsters, where like other nations, it's implied, did not have such an issue because they didn't create the pure and vile blood. After some more unintelligible writing, we learned that by injecting a small amount of vile blood into an organism will not really have an effect. Like there's a certain level of vile blood that needs to be injected before there'll be anything that goes on. But when you reach that point, it becomes like impossible to stop, to control, or whatever, and the mutations just like go wild. Some more unintelligible writing, and then the researcher talks about how there's strange things that occur when the vile blood and the pure blood are injected at the same time. He talks about crystallization, and a drastic increase to the size of the creature, and how it's inevitable that it's going to keep growing and growing and growing. And lastly, he talks about how the injection with the vile blood causes these uncontrollable transformations, right? So they range from a localized mutation to a complete loss of like cognition. It's like you can grow like an extra powerful arm or some bullshit, or it's like you go completely mad, or both, right? And that at some point they had this whole box full of like vile blood, and they packed it and handed it over to knights for disposal. Or he talks about how like whenever they have this vile blood, they gotta pack it up in like a sealed box and give it to the knights for disposal immediately. We find the last page of a researcher's journal, and he talks about how there's a loud noise. There was a loud noise one day, and then a giant hole appeared in the roof of the greenhouse. And then the Hanged Queen appeared. It's like, who's the Hanged Queen? I don't know. We'll find out later. And he's like, oh my God, she broke out of the underground. We're in trouble now. And that her body had grown 3 times since the last time they saw her. And that this guy was able to escape, but like everyone else was like completely massacred in like the greenhouse. So obviously the main boss of this Royal Gardens is the Hanged Queen, which we'll run into at the greenhouse when we finally get there. Then we get a letter of complaint from one of the alchemy researchers. Talks about noises and tremors from experiment number 1 underground. So we can kind of make an assumption here that experiment number 1 may be the Hanged Queen, and that it's making all this noise, doing all this stuff, disturbing the above ground researchers, and that they have to consider that if they're going to do these experiments, if they're going to be able to control them or figure it out or whatnot. There's a giant tree experiment, and they kind of confirm some stuff. They talk about the forest residents have a superhuman resistance to the plague, kind of stuff that was like in the previous level we were finding notes and stuff, and it seemed very superstitious and religious, but there's like a legitimate something about these trees in the Sea of Trees protects the people from the plague. And what they do when they found the research is that when the plague gets attached to like the trees, like the cells of the tree cells like destroy it. So they absorb and decompose the plague. There's a Novus researcher's letter of complaint now. And he's talking about how he spent all this time trying to get in here, trying to become a researcher, doing all these tests, proving his worth. And as soon as he got in and graduated from the Alchemy Academy and whatnot, then now they're just having to do basic blood separation. And then he's like, no, I don't want to do this. I want to work for the thing and do the applied experimentation. Then we get the vial blood experiment records. They talk about how many early experiments find that there is no way to dispose of like the waste from like the pure vial blood experimentation. And that they've tried burning it, they've tried doing all this stuff, but like nothing works. And then they also show that some of the experiments they do have that different people can resist vial blood differently, and also certain species have a natural predilection to resist vial blood as well. That some organisms can resist at very high rates despite their size, right? So then we go back to like all these buckets full of animals that Ordo was collecting. Like maybe he was doing some stuff too with that, but there's no explanation as to like why certain animals and such can like take care of the like are completely resistant to the plague and others are not. The last thing he talks about, or they talk about, is that they discovered something under the ground that was super highly resistant to the vial blood. It was a worm-like creature that it actually fed on the vial blood. And then when they pooped out, whatever it pooped out, there was nothing left in the fecal matter. So it was very unique, and that they talk about how they must research this more and kind of try to figure out what's going on with that. Next up is these... it's complaints from like the underground shift. So whoever's like going down to the underground to do the research or work down there, they're having some problems. And it's pretty much a request to stop sending novices down there, because whatever's going on with these novices, they are like fucking up and it's causing problems for everybody. So they're like, nah, we don't want to be doing that no more. And that these novices, they'll do something, they'll get vial blood on them or something, and then it's like off to the Sea of Fools, which is what the higher ups, like the more ritzy, fancy people on the like above the Sea of Trees, they call the Sea of Trees the Sea of Fools. So that comes up often as like, oh, they're making fun of these people again, or like they're talking shit and whatnot. So there you go. Then we get a pure blood experiment record, which talks about some people just don't think it's worth studying the pure blood. But since its creation also creates vial blood, it's imperative to see if they can be a more potent or long-lasting form of pure blood. Because if you remember from before, I don't know if that comes up yet. But yeah, so we learn later on, if it didn't come up in the sutras, which I actually don't think it did, that people need continuous injections of their pure blood. That it's not like you put pure blood in once and then you're good to go. The next researcher's secret letter from the Sea of Trees mentions that seeing the circus members in the Sea of Fools, and talks about again like how they're stacking buckets around the tents and that stuff like that, and that he needs to report that to the knights so they can see what's going on. Then we get some experiment number 1 observation reports where we learn more about this experiment number 1 that's been hinted at before. And it's all about the queen, right? So people complain about the queen. They're not getting enough sleep. All she can do here in the underground is eat and sleep. And it's causing lots of problems. And she's like stomping around or doing whatever. So of course the queen's always in a bad mood. And to make sure that she doesn't grow any larger, they need to avoid feeding her anything with pure or vial blood in it. But that there was a novice researcher who accidentally like spilt some vial blood on her or something, which caused a growth spurt. And it's like now she's as big as a human when before she was not. And that she's becoming more ill at ease after feeding. And this is likely due to the noise that emanates from the ground. So there's some thumping, thundering noise or something that's coming from even further down than where she's at. And that soldiers have been dispatched down there to kind of check out and see what's going on. We then we find a blood-written letter. And so this individual came into contact with the vial blood and he's being experimented on, and he's locked up underground. So he's not pretty happy about that. And he talks about how there's large earthquakes. Then strange transformation. There was a huge earthquake, and then there was some strange transformations underground. There was a lot of crystalline growth, which was related to the bloods. And that he started growing like crystals on his body besides the changes underground. And then also the sounds from below are becoming more and more like intense. And then finally, the last set of research we find here is a derivative research, which talks about mixing the vial and pure blood and how it produces an uncontrollable result. And that it produces like these blood red crystals that come out. Because pure blood increases biological properties, but then vial blood on top of that can increase and make them even stronger. That there could be something to do. There could be some experimentation here that could be useful, but that they need to find the right levels of dosages for the pure and vile blood to make sure it doesn't become uncontrollable, so they can create like super soldiers essentially without having all the negative side effects. At that point, we're done with all the research that we find, but now we're to the core. So the Hang Queen, which is like a giant bat monster, which is like heavily implied at times in the game to be the actual queen of the world, the Hermes kingdom. So when we find her core, we take it to Isome, and she talks about how it's pure and vile blood fused together, much like the mutated Ordu's core. And that there was no way a normal experimentation would have focused on this purposeful mutation, but maybe there was like some other reasons. Taking it to Emerald, she talks about the pure and vile blood are opposites, but that in the end of the day, they're just different materials. So like any kind of different materials you can combine together and fuse and find different things to go with. And that she talks about how like true research can see past the surface to perceive the actual nature of things. We then find, in one of the sublevels, or sublevels, we find the Hermes Answer research notebook. When taking it to Isome, she talks about working with her teacher, and that the function of the Hermes Answer is to spread pure blood over a wide area, and that if they can kind of figure that out, then they can protect people from the plague. But that the formula is the most important part, so that like just the Hermes Answer, which is the device that kind of like spreads the pure blood, is not the answer. The formula you put inside is what's going to have the effect. And that's why she needs us, because somehow we're going to help her figure that out. Emerald talks about how she carried out this research for the Hermes Answer, specifically at the king's request, and that it was to speed up the dissemination of pure blood, and that the Hermes Answer is complete, but that what actually happens when it's used is dependent purely on the formula we put into it. And this is like some meta stuff, because like the ending of the game determines, like the game ends when you use the Hermes Answer with a formula, and so what the formula is up to you, essentially, Corvus, when you get there. So this is kind of giving you like a hint about that. And we find another thing called the Hermes Answer formula research. Taking it to Isome, she talks about how that a high concentration of pure blood can suppress the plague. And it can even remove life force of monsters and the mutated. And that is why she's asked us to gather these cores as part. These cores are like part of the formula. Taking it to Emerald, she talks about the Hermes Answer is an easy concept, that it uses crystals to increase the formula's effectiveness. So you put the formula in there, and then it increases the formula's effectiveness and spreads it out. And that this is really the final answer to the plague. But she warns us to be careful, because our decisions are going to have long-lasting, effects and whatnot. And then finally, at the very bottom of like the underground, we find the Sound of the Abyss, which is this worm that was hinted at not having any effects from taking the vile blood. It made it super big, and it like summons crystals and shit, and so it's a fun boss. So when we kill that, we get the Sound of the Abyss core. We take it back to Isome, and she's like, wow, it's hard to imagine there was a more vicious creature filled with vile blood than the queen, the Hang Queen. And then Emerald is like, again, like with the idol, the false idol, their fool's idol, is like, wow, this is a very interesting creature. It's too bad you had to kill it. It's like, okay, Emerald, thanks. The next part of the game, the next level, is the Hermes Fortress, and the Hermes Fortress is almost like the final, right? There's a fourth part, but it's pretty much just like a final boss battle, and you make your final decision. And I don't really count like the philosopher's home. So in Hermes Fortress, we find an administrative order that talks about how the epidemic outbreak and the state of emergency, and how citizens are forbidden from going out, that the knights will deliver supplies, and that everyone just needs to stay away from all the plagues and mutations, and if there's any corpses that are unclean, they're going to be turned over to the knights immediately. We find a paper on the ground. It talks about the city being sealed up, locked down, there's no food, there's no water, and that any pathways around or even out of the kingdom are lined with monsters, dead bodies, or blocked by soldiers, so no one can enter or leave. An anonymous soldier's diary talks about the king's dagger and the gray armor are being the last hope, and we find out later these are Erd and Varg, who are kind of the heads of the knightly orders, and one of them is the princess, the king's dagger. That they've led the survivors to try to make things right, but that, again, infected corpses are burned. A resident's diary talks about how everything began to get bad. The incident that occurred was on the king's birthday, and that beforehand the kingdom was spared the plague, but now everyone's gone mad. In a soldier's sachet, we again get like a recipe. It talks about how it is filled with the scent of mint and lavender, as well as some sort of pungent odor. So just like the tale of the thieves and the vinegar. The diary of a knight's mother talks about her son was given the blessing of pure blood, and she prayed that he could stay with Edward the Healer, who is the king. Alas, he was sent to distant lands. So even though this plague is going on and people are, this pure blood, people are still being sent away to do what? Right? This is the complaint we read about a little bit earlier. Every time the son comes back, he brings a souvenir from his expeditions, and it's always something bizarre, like a broken arrowhead, broken shields. She states that he would bring back parts from the monsters if they didn't burn them all. And that most people just bring back like stones or leaves from these expeditions. And then the last souvenir that he was given was an amulet that she had given her son, and it was delivered by his Grand Master, because all those who fall in this battle are burned. So the amulet is all that is left of him. And then the Grand Master mentioned that this whole thing is meaningless and the sacrifices will hopefully end soon. In a pure blood injection record, we see that in order for the soldiers to remain strong, that the pure blood injections continue to be given, but that maintaining the supply has started to become very difficult, as it kind of was hinted before. A Diary of an Unknown Knight talks about how serving the Hermes kingdom is his greatest honor, that they get to prove their strength by aiding the neighboring kingdoms. But that as monsters start appearing in their kingdom and more knights have fallen, he doesn't understand why people are still being sent to war, to a faraway war that's not their own. We get a notice for a troop selection ceremony, so everyone gathers up. If there's anybody who's infected, they're left, they get kicked out, and then those who are left get injected. And then if they report any discomfort, they immediately get got over to the greenhouse. Otherwise, they're selected to be part of the King's Royal Guard or the Knights of the Pure Blood and given the Pure Blood. We find another note on Hermes' life about the fortress, and the fortress has many districts. There's an outer wall, residential area, punishment plaza, where all the executions occur, and that around the residential area surrounds a sacred tree, and that two of the most sacred spots are there too. There's Marty's Cemetery and Thymesia Cathedral, which are both heavily guarded. His Silver Servant's notebook talks about Urd, the Gerd captain and heir of the throne, right? So the princess, Princess Asame's older sister, and that how she is very concerned about the infected and the monsters. That she's been preparing for the king's birthday, so this takes place before the incident, but then that after the incident in the Sea of Fools, which again all the nobles call the Sea of Trees the Sea of Fools, and the cysts and the blisters, right? That's the incident, the fog, the thing that Urd did that kind of set this whole thing up. That she's very distressed, that Urd is very distressed, and that the rumors of the circus collecting alchemical waste, which alchemical waste is the vile blood, has spurred her to send Urd to send knights down to the Sea of Fools to find out more. And I mean, we read some of those records when we were down there. You know, they were sent there as like help with the researchers, and they started doing investigations to see what was going on. Then we get a Hermes local announcement about the king's birthday. Royals are invited to party. Commoners get work off. The Twilight Circus is going to provide free performance to general public for the residents of the Sea of Trees and of the residents here in the residents of the Sea of Trees. We find a note of an unknown resident. It complains about working for meager compensation, spending years worth of savings for the blessing of pure blood, and then if you're shown any symptoms at all, you're immediately cast off to be with the hopeless, as they call them, in the Sea of Fools. The Diary of an Unknown Resident talks about how Urd cares deeply for her people. She often pardons those committed of petty crimes and also provides blessings of pure blood to all the servants in the royal residences. And they talk about how she'll be as great of a leader as her father, King Edward the Healer. Then we find some royal rumors. And it's that Ordur, the ringmaster, right, the guy we killed, he is actually a royal, that he was cast off when his mother was infected with the plague. Also talks about some of these rumors that the queen is never seen, right? There's rumor that there's a sealed room in the royal residence where she lies that no one can enter. And again, if you're playing through this game and looking at everything, and I'll talk about this a little more at the end when I kind of sum up everything. But it seems that the Hanged Queen, obviously, is the name of the bat monster, is the queen, and that something happened to her where she was infected with this stuff. And there's also kind of like, this game leaves a lot of ambiguity, but you could also almost say like Ordur might be a member of the royal house, right? So there's two princesses, and that he might be related, but there's no firmness about that at all. Anyway, so then marshalling of the Knights of the Pure Blood, and this is one of the last things we find, and it talks about how Grey Armor, right, of Arg, he personally called for the marshalling of 4 divisions on the day of the king's birthday celebration, but that it was also done secretly. So obviously there was something going on, right? If it was like a treasonous act or but clearly Varg knew something more about what was going on, because why would he have done this secretly in this marshalling order that we find in one of these sub quests? All right, and then at that point, we have 2 more cores to talk about. We have Varg's core, and Varg is the Grey Armor, right? He's the big knight, and at the very beginning of the game, when you first start your tutorial, he's the guy who just fucking kills you. Isami talks about how he was a silent warrior, or he's a silent warrior, and he sacrificed himself for Hermes' kingdom. and that his core is his final offering. And when taken to Emerald, she talks about how Varg was the first to receive the blessing of pure blood, as well as his highest user. And then she kind of reemphasizes that when people use the pure blood, that it not only makes them immune from the plague, but it enhances them, makes them bigger. And that each time he came back for more, his eyes were more and more lifeless. And again, when you're reading about these cores and learning about the cores, the big thing to take away from the cores is that these cores are directly related to, I know I said core like 500 times, are directly related to the formula. So when you're constructing your formula at the end of the game, you got to look at all the different cores to make a final decision about like what kind of world do you want to leave behind, right? And then so you can see it's like, well, if we do the cores of the pure blood, the pure vial, or the pure blood, like what's going to happen to the people, right? Are they going to be themselves? Are they going to be like this kind of soulless, like, are they going to be a different kind of monster, right? And then Urd's cores, the princess, Isami, when you show it to her, she forgives Corvus for killing her sister because she ordered Corvus to go and get the cores and to finish the formula of the Hermes answer to solve the problem of the plague. And then Emerald, when you show it, she talks about how Urd was also injected with large amounts of pure blood, that she had an unwavering commitment to the kingdom and the people, but that she finally found out, when she finally found out about the cost of alchemy, she grew more and more angry. She was not a big fan of the whole alchemy thing. All right, so let's do a quick rundown. So that's all the documentation, right? And we literally, that's all you get. That's the story. You literally start the game, you play a tutorial, you get defeated by the gray armor, which doesn't get called that, Varg, and then you like wake up, Isami's like, you got to remember the formula, you got to remember yada yada yada. And then this is all we get, right? You play through these levels, and like Ord makes some like asinine comments, so does Varg and Urd when you fight them, and everyone else is a monster. So everything we've covered is like the entire story. It's like everything. So you got to put it together, right? And so I'm not saying I'm the definitive answer to this. You can find a lot of theories on Reddit and whatever. I mean, this game's not that popular, so you're not going to like get too swamped. It's not like an Elden Ring or Dark Souls where people talk for like hours and hours. Just me about the lore of this. But the general timeline, as I'm putting it together based on all that information I've just given, is that there was a plague outbreak throughout the world, and it seems to be that it was started by an alchemist. Probably Emerald, I would say. But there's nothing defining that specifically, except that she just kind of like wandered over here after the plague had started and seemed to be like really interested in like getting this thing hammered out, right? So you could say there was some guilt in that, but there's nothing like really, that's just more of like a gut feeling that I have. It's that she somehow is related to like this plague outbreak generally, and then also how Hermes' kingdom like surviving it. So because they're able to develop the pure blood, and because of the sacred the Sea of Trees, right? The sacred trees. The Hermes Kingdom manages to develop like a solution to this problem. Unfortunately, the pure blood development also creates the vile blood, and so because of the consequence, they have all this tainted blood, which they don't know what to do with. So that starts causing mutations. It starts causing other problems. They're trying to like figure out what to do with it. Somehow, it seems like the queen got because it talks about anytime it touches anything, it's like causes problems. So it seems like the queen was affected by this. The vile blood, and she also had the pure blood in her, and then it mixed, and that's what created the Hanged Queen's, the bat mutation monster. Because when you defeat her, she has both vile and pure blood, and then Ordu, who also has the vile and pure blood cores. So there's like two cores. There's like two vile cores, two pure cores, and then two mixed cores. Right, so there's a total of 6 cores. So it seems like Ordu did it on purpose. Like he was taking pure blood, and then he kind of like did all this stuff and realized he could add the vile blood and become even stronger and like mutate, which he did. He has like when you fight him as the mutated version, he's got like another like he's got like mutant arm like Resident Evil. Okay, so these experiments by the researchers in the greenhouse so you had Emerald in like the royal gardens, and Ordu secretly conducting a lot of these like experiments and fusing these things together, and that's you start getting these monsters, and you start getting like the Fool's Idol and all this other stuff. And so at some point, Emerald, with Isami's help, developed the Hermes answer, which is like a device that they can use that will somehow, when you put the formula, the cores in there, it will spread something throughout the kingdom and the world that will do something, right? But the formula, depending on what the formula is, that'll change the effects. So the research, I mean, the use of the Hermes answer has to be put on hold because the researcher who is the main person who discovered and like did the formula is actually Corvus, and he dies. Now, it doesn't say he died of the plague necessarily, but it's like he died. And so like because of his death, he was like resurrected through alchemy by Emerald. And the way she did it was by combining the sacred tree into a raven and then putting it inside him, which is why he has the immunity to the plague, and also that he's able to like keep resurrecting when he dies at these like these memory chairs or whatever, right? So it's like there's a piece of him that is full of the vile blood, and there's a piece of him that's filled with the pure blood. So he's also a mix, but because of like the Raven introduction, it seems he's able to like have more power over like his decision making, and like he's not as like mutated or whatever. And that he's one of the few people that this worked for. And it seems like there are other people. I don't ever remember meeting anyone else, but there's like hints that like, oh yeah, this experimentation like did work with you, but maybe not others. Anyway, so because you were defeated, you were beat the shit out of by Grey Armor. You have to recover your memories to figure out what the formula is, so that, and then you have to gather the cores so that you can utilize the cores inside the Hermes answer to construct the formula. And then once you do that, then you can go with Isome and like utilize the Hermes answer to like do something. All right, and so we learn all about that by, again, like learning from Isome, taking the cores to Isome and Emerald and kind of learning about them and and putting things together. And then we kind of like relive moments in the past, it seems, while also like currently going through things at the same time. So this is kind of helping jog memories, but also I get a little confused. Like some of this seems like memories and some of this is not. And so we go back and explore these major locations, find stuff, find these cores, fight, and that kind of gets us to this point. Because like when we fight Erd, for example, it's clearly like that is happening now because Isome is like, yeah, I asked you to do that. But then when we go fight Ord the first time, it's almost like, is this a memory that or like Order, is this a memory we're having, or are we going actually right now to the Sea of Trees to like learn about the formula, and while we're doing that, we defeat Ordu. I was always a little confused about like, is this all taking place currently, or are there like past stuff? Because especially when you start, it's like let's remember what happened in the past, and you go click on something like a book essentially, and it's like, would you like to remember the past? And you're like, yes, and then you kind of go to the Sea of Trees. All right, so once he has all the cores, and once he has all the main cores, so there's like, so he'll get a vile core from Ordu, he'll get a mixed core from the Hanged Queen, and then he can get a pure core from Varg. Once he has those three, the game, you can like end the game. But then you have to do like a mixed formula, and that leads to like a certain ending. And there's 6 endings, so you can do the mixed ending, and we'll get to that in a second. Oh, and the last thing you do, so after you go through all that, after you beat the bosses of the 3 levels, then you can go to the Sea of Memories, I think is what it's called, and there you fight Corvo has to fight himself. Because again, there's like the plague side and the pure side. And so once you fight, the fight ends ambiguous. Like you have to fight like a Dark Souls boss of yourself, but once you defeat yourself, it's not like the guy dies. It's because that's like supposed to be your plague self and you're supposed to be the pure self. It's like they go to attack each other and then it goes black, and then you're back in the Philosopher's Hill, and Isome's like, are you ready for the thing, the formula? And then you have to like choose what kind of formula you're going to put together. You have to choose the 2 cores you're going to use, and that leads to the endings, right? So it's indicated that like if you're like, maybe if the plague guy wins, there's 5 endings, yeah. If the plague guy wins, then like that's what you're going for. But if it's like the pure side, then you're going to go for that ending or whatnot. All right. So here are the endings. So the first ending is a chaos ending. This is where you combine like a pure core and a vile core. And so if you do that, it leads to like unpredictability, chaotic life, crazy life forms start coming forth. Some people turn to grotesque monsters. Some people are healed at random. It's just like complete chaos. The next ending is the power of vile ending. And this is where you put the 2 vile bloods in there, and the plague spreads, turning everybody into all the humans into grotesque monsters that become increasingly more and more aggressive, right? It's like evolution, just like Ordu wanted. And then there's the blessing of the pure blood, and this is where you put the 2 pure cores in there, and if you do that, the plague ends, all the monsters disappear, but some people start becoming stronger, some people don't, and then it's like the ambitious begin to vie for control over alchemy, and it's clear like this is going to lead to like more bad stuff. And it's like one of those things like, well, the plague's cured, but like what if we rot, right? Like some people have like superpowers and stuff like that, and it's not going to be like Superman good times. It's going to be like more sad times for everybody. Then there's like the 2 kind of like middle ground endings. So the first one is the harmonized force, and this is where you take Ordu's mutated core and the Hanged Queen, the 2 mixed cores, and you use them, and so the plague is cleansed, as well as people get stronger. Oh no, and all the people got stronger, they're also cleansed, so everyone's like back to level, so it leaves just ordinary people. Hermes is safe, but the rest of the world is not, and Isome continues her alchemy research, and the game says someday maybe the plague will be quelled throughout the world. And then the final ending is while you're using the Hermes answer with the harmonized force ending. So when you use the Hanged Queen or mutated Ordu's core, and then you like hold forward. I don't know how you're supposed to configure this out. Like I obviously looked it up, but you hold forward while you're doing that, and then after he uses the the Hermes answer, Corvus like shoves it inside him, killing himself and collapsing. And because of the sacrifice, it spreads the knowledge of alchemy, that alchemy is dangerous and that it needs to be used with caution, and that the plague wasn't instantly cured in this, but it stops spreading and it starts to heal, and the world starts moving towards a brighter future. That like all the people, like kind of like before, it's like all the people who got stronger and all the plague stuff, people aren't like cured, but it like stops. And so there's, the ending indicates that someday people will learn how to coexist with one another, essentially, and be able to use alchemy just for good and not for like developing plagues and whatnot. And that's Thymesia. So it's good stuff. I'm glad I went back and played through it, uber levering myself up with some cheat engine magic, because it was a good time. It was like very interesting and it's a very short game. So I wouldn't necessarily say go play it, but I like kind of the mythology they built in this and kind of some of the stuff that was going on. It was very interesting, and I did enjoy kind of like a short jaunt through one of these games, and it's, good stuff. So anyway, go ahead, like, share, subscribe, comment, and I'll catch you guys later. Bye.